Up until this point, I've avoided discussing the negative perception of comic books at length. I wanted to first point out what I feel to be the truth about comic books and the potential the art form has. I also wanted to elaborate upon the development of the mature audience comic book market. I brought these topics up right away in order to illustrate just how silly the notion of comic books being kid stuff really is. Why is it that comic books are so maligned and looked down upon? It's amazing that one of the only pure American art forms is so underappreciated in America. No other country in the world thinks so little of the comic book form. Manga artists in Japan are rich and famous, but American comics artists are often happy just to break even. European department stores have rooms full of graphic novels for sale. Yet, American comic books can only be found in small, struggling stores designed specifically for them. American comic books and comic book characters are popular in every country in which they're available, except the United States. Revolutionary comics artists around the world are persecuted and jailed for fear that their political views will spread because comics are so popular. Museums worldwide display works created by famous comics artists, and in the United States, the one museum dedicated to comic book art has been homeless for 4 years. In terms of the public perception of comic books, something is very wrong in the US. And again, at least part of the problem lies in the roots of the medium itself. When the notion of comic books first caught on, and it was known that people would be willing to pay for them, they were often produced mainly as a way to keep printing presses running, so as to maximize efficiency and profits. Their entertainment value was of little consequence to the publishers. When they ran out of material to reprint and were forced to come up with original material, publishers hired cheap labor to do the work in assembly line fashion. Talent and training weren't always important. Anything would do, as long as it kept the presses rolling. Pay was given per page, rather than salary, so quantity was rewarded over quality. Art was treated as a commodity. One artist was as good as another, as long as the work got done. At the art shops where comic book art was cranked out, the workers were generally either very young, hoping to use comic book work as a springboard to more lucrative positions, or very old, past their creative peak and fallen on hard times, taking jobs at the art shops just to make ends meet. Thus, for one reason or another, many of the artists involved in creating comic books saw their work as second-rate employment, and certainly not where they intended to be. They didn't consider themselves to be true artists. While there were some who recognized the inherent possibilities of comics and pursued it as a valid art form, these were few and far between. So, the prevailing attitude came to be that comic books were not art, and certainly not literature, since they so often had stories that were dashed off with little regard to quality. Since they were so cheaply produced, printed on shabby paper, and drawn in an assembly line, they were ultimately disposable. Not even those involved in their creation had much respect for comic books. Add to this the fact that many early comic books featured characters and stories that appealed especially to children, funny animals, troublesome kids, and slapstick antics. As I stated way back in Chapter 1, comic books held a special attraction for children, being colorful, especially once the four-color convention was created by MC Gaines, inexpensive, and ubiquitous at newsstands and drugstores. Comic books have an innately imitative nature, given the earliest original comic books simply mimic the style of newspaper strips, and that same tendency comes into play here. Once it became clear that children were interested in comic books, publishers began aggressively targeting them. After the introduction of Superman in 1938, every comic book publisher scrambled to create their own superheroes, many of which were just cheap knockoffs of Superman. Examples to the contrary notwithstanding, the general consensus became that comic books were primarily the domain of silly characters and outlandish power fantasies, and beneath the notice of adults.